All right, let's go for it. Let's go for it. So I'm Kevin O'Connor. Welcome to Academic Publishing. Tonight we're going to look at the landscape of university presses. We've got four amazing editors for you from top tier academic publishers, university presses. I'm really excited that you're here. This event is part of the Graduate Initiative for Inclusion and Engagement, and we're in partnership with the Graduate School of Arts and the Sciences and University Life. So many thanks to Gabby, who's going to be running things in the background and has been my right-hand person doing everything. Unisha, Selena, and Ishal, who've really been great supports for this entire series. A little rundown of what we're going to do tonight. We're going to do some intros. We're going to talk about the mission of university presses, what the different kinds of publications that a press does, journals, books, and we'll talk a little bit about the different types of books, et cetera, et cetera. And then we're going to talk about the proposal process, and then there's some things that are unique to university presses, and we'll get into that. And we'll find out what the editing process is like, and ask the very key question: do you need an agent to go to an academic press? And talk a little bit about marketing. So for introductions, why don't we, I'm going to stop the share here and have our guests introduce themselves. Ale, you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you so much, Kevin. My name is Alejandra Mejia, or Ale, and I'm an assistant editor at Duke University Press. I acquire specifically within the field of Latinx history, but I have also acquired a little bit outside that field in more interdisciplinary projects and like ethnic studies, critical race studies. Yeah, I also manage our student worker program in the books editorial department at Duke Press. So I'm also happy to talk about just the experience of like interning at a university press or share resources around that. And I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ale. Laura from Johns Hopkins University Press.
Hi, I'm Laura Davulis. I look after our lists in American history and as well as our list in contemporary affairs. The latter of which is not really an academic discipline. It's a list that's characterized by books about problems that are going wrong right now, and those authors may come from any discipline. So part of my work is working primarily with historians, and then part of my work is working with people who come from, all different parts of the university.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura. Emily?
Hi, everybody. My name is Emily Silk. I'm an acquisitions editor at Harvard University Press, and I work broadly in history, literary studies, and religion. I, too, would also be very happy to talk online or offline about careers in publishing. I came to publishing from a PhD in English. So if anyone is pursuing their graduate studies and interested in that side of things, can also talk about that.
Excellent. Thank you. And Stephen.
Hello, I'm Stephen Wesley. I play for the home team. I'm an editor at Columbia University Press, and I acquire in American history and American politics. I too would be happy to talk about careers in publishing. I also did my graduate work right here at Columbia in journalism and had a kind of roundabout way into publishing. And thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. If you have any questions, you feel free to type them into the chat. I know that people got an opportunity as well before the event to ask questions, and hopefully we can definitely get to those. We can definitely talk a little bit about publishing as well. I'm really excited about that. I would love to talk a little bit about the mission of the university press. What sets it apart from a trade publisher? Something that like the big five, the Penguin Random Houses, the mission that you have to your community of scholars, to your university, and to the growth of knowledge in general. Ale, you want to kick us off?
Sure, I'm happy to. Yeah, so the mission of university presses is to disseminate knowledge and scholarship and to support academia as an institution, I would say. So to support the scholarship of, academics, and to grow those particular disciplines that the press specializes in. So I'm thinking about Duke University Press in particular, and we're known for being a humanities and social sciences publisher. And something that I would add to the Duke Press mission specifically is that we're always looking for progressive scholarship. And so scholarship that is politically progressive, that touches on issues of social justice and identity. And so I would tie that into the mission that Duke Press has as a publisher, as an academic publisher. But more broadly, it's to ensure academic excellence and just cultivate knowledge and scholarship and contribute in those ways to culture and society and academia. But I'm also happy to hear what others have to say.
Yeah. Emily, you want to take a crack at that?
I think that was a beautiful answer, which I would echo in its entirety. So yes, the mission of academic presses and Harvard Press specifically, just as Duke, is to advance scholarship across a broad range of fields. And I am always looking for books, and I will get into the proposals conversation a little bit later, but I'm always looking for proposals and projects that can show me what is it that this book is doing that no other book in the field is doing. Like, why should your colleagues in whatever field you are in pick up this book? Why do they need it? And when there's a compelling answer to that set of questions, that's really exciting to me as an editor. And it sort of helps me in what I think is my role, which is to bring the press's lists in my areas in exciting new directions, following sort of the exciting new directions that we're seeing in the fields themselves. So that's the start of an answer to that.
Excellent. Stephen, do you want to weigh in?
Sure. This is going to get repetitive because I agree very much with Alejandra and Emily. I'll just say it in other words the way we talk about it at Columbia Press. We see our mission as serving the academy, and we do that in two ways. We publish, cutting edge, envelope pushing scholarship in the fields in which we publish. And this is true, mission-driven nonprofit publishing, because we do, say the best new book in continental philosophy that's at such a high level that it's read by, the 200 working continental philosophers. And then the way we kind of make the rest of our budget up is we publish books out of the academy for general audiences. So we kind of interpret new scholarship on issues of pressing current concern for broader audiences. But even our, what we call crossover books or trade books, even those, we try to pull those out of the academy. And I see part of my job is, translating scholarship into English, so to say.
Excellent. Laura?
Yeah, I would add one thing, which I think is not true for anyone here, but is true of some of our colleagues at other UPs and particularly at state institutions, which is many university presses are one of the only, if not the only, publisher in their state. And so part of that work is often folks at those institutions will often understand part of their work is, publishing for the people of that state, whether or not they are academics. We do some regional books at Hopkins. We don't do a super lot. We're Maryland and DC area is actually pretty thick with publishers. But, for example, LSU Press does great work publishing about Louisiana. West Virginia University Press obviously does great work. So that's another aspect. University presses in those areas are often much more attentive to those local markets and know them much better.
Excellent. Laura, does Johns Hopkins do any journals? Is that something that is in your purview or your colleagues' purview?
We do journals. It is not in my purview. And I'm probably not well positioned to answer any specific questions about them other than we have a lot of them.
Okay.
It's a very separate operation.
Is that something that comes up, and is anyone on the team weigh in? Is that something that comes up that people reach out to you and you're like, should it be a book or should it be an article?
Yeah. Most of the time I get people who have a fully formed book idea. I do occasionally get people where I think, tell me why this needs to be a whole book. But you know, again, I'm working primarily with historians who tend to think in like full book arguments, right? That's sort of the discipline, so.
I would also add that sometimes it's from an article that I make my way to someone's book project. So if I see a piece online or in a journal that I think is interesting, you know, sometimes I'll follow that thread and discover that someone's working on a book project that is related to that work. And then that's very exciting and I reach out. But I would echo Laura and say, yeah, usually when someone is coming with a book proposal, it's a fully fledged project. And we do not publish articles, journal publication at HEP.
Excellent. Ale or Stephen, anything to add there?
Yeah, I'll just add briefly that at Duke Press, we also work on journals, and similar to what Laura was saying, the journals department is sort of very separate from the books editorial department. So I have more familiarity with books, but we publish around 150 books a year, and we have more than 50 journals in-house. Yeah, and so most of the time journals are sort of run by faculty in like a specific like department or school. And so the editors that we have for journals at the press are more like managing editors. So they sort out some of the logistics and work with like the editorial like faculty or the editorial board of the journal. So that's something to note, whereas book editors work directly with the authors or with the series editors to like develop like a book series. Yeah, so we publish more than 50 journals in humanities, social sciences, and then we also have a math journal. So that's something that's different from the books, which really do focus on humanities and social sciences, is that we do have a math journal, which is, you know, pretty well known. So yeah, so that's just something that I would add about like Duke Press specifically.
We don't have a journal program either, so I know no more than anyone here about journal, probably less about journal publishing. And like Emily said, I also publish in history, and the great pleasure of working with historians is there's always a book. Everything they do is pointing toward the next book project. But to your point, Kevin, we did used to say a lot. I used to publish in business and life sciences and some of the less book-oriented fields, and it would be a common refrain in editorial meetings. You know, is this really of the scope of a book, or is this a journal article or a collection of articles? The idea containing a book has to be, you know, big enough for a book. And so we do think about that a lot.
Excellent. So there are a couple of different parts that, from my understanding, I'm kind of new to publishing. I've only been in it for about 8 or 9 years, that really distinguish a university press. One is that there's actually a separate editorial board made up of professors and outside people who say, yes, this deserves the imprimatur of the university press, and it's good enough. And there's a peer review process, which we're going to talk about. And there's also the fact that this is one of the few places that a dissertation, a specific monograph, could actually get published. That if you tried to bring a dissertation to HarperCollins or Hachette or any of the big publishers, they would need a lot of changes before it goes to the general public. Can we talk a little bit about what the mandate is in terms of publishing dissertations? Are they just a dissertation? Is there are they going to specific customers, libraries? is there something neat that needs to be more than just the dissertation for it to get your attention? And that's open to the group.
I welcome this question. I work on a lot of first books that were dissertations, and my refrain always to the author is the dissertation is not the book. It's never the book. And the dissertation always transforms, often quite radically, between the time it's submitted to the registrar at your university and the time you submit a final version of the manuscript to your editor. I often work quite closely with authors on that transformation of the dissertation to the book. We'll get into this a little bit later, but at HUP, our acquisitions process is such that we offer our contracts upfront, and then I work with each author to prepare the book for peer review. And for books that once were dissertations, often that means ripping it apart, putting it back together in a new form. You write the dissertation for your committee, which is usually 3 or 4 senior faculty in your fields. You write the book for a much larger audience, even if that audience is still primarily a scholarly audience. And so you're thinking very high level about what's the right structure for the book. How do you communicate the arguments, maybe not only to people in your field, but people in adjacent fields? Or as Stephen said, if the ambition is to reach undergraduates or readers outside the academy, sort of there's a way that you think and write on the page that may be different. So I would say yes, dissertations are some of the places where the most cutting edge, exciting new work is happening, but the book looks very different in terms of its form. But I'd be really curious to hear what everyone else has to say.
Laura?
Yeah, just to build on something Emily alluded to, the standard piece of advice that I give when I'm working with an author who's revising a dissertation is that anything that they added in a panic at 3 a.m. should immediately come out of the manuscript. And usually people meet that proclamation with relief. Sometimes they meet it with more fear, actually. But, you know, you are, when you're writing a dissertation, you are writing, it's a defensive document. You are writing it in a defensive crouch because you want to get that degree and you know that you have to satisfy 3 or 4 people and you're gonna do what you've got to do, right? And I think, you know, even a revised dissertation is still a specialized piece of work in almost every case, but, you know, you do have a bit more freedom to explore and to really write about what interests you and to not worry that, you know, someone is going to assume that you're not an expert. Because once you have written a dissertation and gotten the PhD, you are now the world's expert in your thing, whatever it is. That's it. You know the most. You certainly know more than I do, right? So, you know, I think you have to start thinking of yourself as an expert, right? And you have to think of your readers as people who are going to think of you as an expert, right? So there's the sort of practical work of revision, and there's also, I think, a lot of psychological readjustment as well.
Excellent. Ale?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That's one of the main things that I was thinking is that one of the sort of one of the points of feedback that I give first-time authors is to really think about making a bold argument. So just echoing what Laura was saying about you are the expert. So as a graduate student, you know, you are doing a lot of citations or like lit review. And as an author who's publishing their book, you're really thinking about, you know, yeah, you're really thinking of yourself as an expert and bringing your argument forward and everybody else's arguments to back up your own. But you're really stepping into that role of, you know, that the scholars and academics that you admire and that you're citing in your own dissertation. So, you know, that looks like in writing using a more like authoritative tone and really bringing your argument forward. Also telling a narrative throughout your story, throughout your book. So thinking about how different chapters build up on each other. But also to go back to what Emily was saying, you know, if you're thinking about your book being used for teaching, you know, thinking about the narrative that's told throughout the book, but also how separate chapters can be extracted from your manuscript and be taught in classrooms. And so it's a little bit of a, you know, difficult balance to strike, but yeah, I think that's why it's so helpful to attend conversations like this one, is because a lot of people are not taught how to write a book, you know, when they're in graduate school, they're taught how to write a dissertation. And I didn't get a PhD, so I don't know what it's like to write a dissertation on your own. So it's definitely been a learning experience for me too. But yeah, I've been so grateful to learn from the other editors and to just work directly with authors and see how that process happens and how the dissertation develops into a book project. Yeah, so that's what I would add.
Excellent. Thank you for saying narrative, because we're going to come right back to that. That was the key word. Stephen.
Yeah, we've achieved consensus again. I completely agree with my colleagues. I use something similar to what Laura said about the kind of inversion. You know, the student. It's like a student has become the master kind of thing. Bill Germano, who's an editor formerly at Columbia, who wrote a book called Dissertation to Book Manuscript. He says that dissertation is a very paranoid genre. It's always looking over its shoulder, making sure you sprinkle the right citations and names, and nobody descends on you angrily if you don't. And not so with the book. You know, in a way that kind of the shackles are off. It doesn't have to be just this clean, boring outlay of scholarship. You can write a fun narrative. You know, you can put in the stuff that is just vignettes or anecdotes or interesting stories you found in the archives. And it doesn't just have to be, a perfunctory introduction, 4 chapters that could be really put in any order, and then a conclusion. And to Emily's point, I also want authors, what I am most happy to see in a prospective first book author is a kind of distaste for their dissertation, like a real desire to implode it and then to take all the pieces of it and use it as raw material for the book. What I don't like to hear is when someone says, I wrote the dissertation with the book in mind. Not that that's a bad way to think about it, but I don't want them to be in the mindset that like the work is mostly done, because the work is maybe halfway done, but the other half is a lot more fun.
Excellent. Was just weighing in myself, my own clients, I am not a PhD and I'm more on the commercial side, but my own clients who have PhDs, I'm always like, oh, you should be more polemical. And they try to be more balanced. And I'm like, but the more polemical, the easier it is for me to sell it. So go out on a limb and say something crazy, because at least they'll get people's attention. In Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point, he talks about I come from children's television, so he specifically brings up the idea in Sesame Street that things are very, very short, 1 or 2 minutes. They almost use a commercial type way because the thought was that kids' minds couldn't track a longer narrative. And then Blue's Clues came along in the early 2000s, late 90s, and showed that kids could actually learn more and retain the episode better with a structure of narrative to it. So Alain mentioned the narrative, like what, and every editor I talk to, every nonfiction editor I talk to goes, that it's got to be narrative. What the heck does that mean? Emily. This is where it's going to get controversial. This is where people are going to be like, no, it's.
So I think there are a few different ways to answer this question. And again, I'll be interested to hear others' perspectives. Especially thinking about a first book, I often think more in terms of through lines and characters. So what we don't want, right, is a book that feels like a collection of articles that, as Stephen said, could be rearranged in any order, and sort of you get the same thing. And so there are different ways to build a narrative, right? Sometimes it's chronology. Often that is the simplest and most elegant sort of way to organize a story. But there are other ways, thematic ways, to think about organizing your narrative. What I want to see, though, and I think it's really important to start thinking about this at the stage of the book proposal, is each chapter is a building block. What is it building on that came before it? And what is it building towards that comes after it? Where are the continuities? Where are the turns? What are the arguments that are going to course through the book from start to finish? Sometimes you may have guides, narrative guides, characters who you follow throughout the book. Sometimes you may not. If you, depending on what archive you're working in, if you're a historian. But I think maybe for me, it's through lines, specifically argumentative through lines when we're talking about scholarly books. And that makes transitions, which I think can often be some of the most challenging parts of the book to write. How do you get from the end of one chapter to the beginning of the next? Those are incredibly important moments to sort of make this feel, the book feel like like it has a backbone, and it's not a group of sort of detachable objects that can be pulled apart. Now, also, if you're interested in speaking to undergraduates, right, as Ale said, you may want excerptable pieces because most scholarly books, if they're going to be taught in undergraduate classrooms, it's going to be a chapter or two. It's not going to be the whole book. But I think sort of balancing that and making sure that this is a story that has a beginning, middle, and end is something I really work on, especially when you're coming from a dissertation where that's often the lowest order priority.
Laura?
Yeah, I would say, again, speaking, I work, 90% of my authors are professional historians by training, and they write books in chronological order, and that works. Don't overthink it. That's the way that time works. Everyone who reads this book will be familiar with the way that time works. You're good. Just tell the story in order. But, the other thing that I like to tell people, and it's kind of a cliche, but I think it's also true, which is, people like to read about people. There need to be people in your story. If there are no people in your story, you are a geologist, right? And that's fine. And the world needs geologists, but, that's not the book that you want to write. And that's not the book that I want you to write. So, I think, when you can find those sort of tentpole hooks, guides to your story, that's really helpful. Now, there are subfields where this is harder, right? I think it's really hard in economic history. It's hard in anything that gets technical. It's hard in anything that gets theoretical. But by and large, you are writing about people. Make sure there are people in your story, because that is, and particularly if you want to reach readers outside the academy, that is what readers are looking for, is human beings.
Excellent. Stephen?
Yeah, I too, like Laura, mostly do history, so we're a little spoiled because historians know that they're engaged in kind of a naturally narrative project, and mostly they write chronologically. One, I agree with Emily, though, even in the non-history fields, you want your reader to go from point A to point B, and you want them to feel like the movement forward is perceptible to them, like stepping stones to the other side of the river. And so a lot of signposting is important. I tend to say more in fewer chapters. I find that a lot of academics tend to use chapter breaks as partitions to fully contain individual themes or arguments. This is something historians often do fall into because they tend to have hybrid chronological thematic structures. And so you'll find they have like an 8-chapter book, and the first 3 chapters are a decade of history each. And then I was editing a proposal last week, and it was about international white supremacist movements. And then like plunked in the middle of the book was, and here's a chapter just dealing on the women of this movement across the whole time span, the rest of the book covers. And that's really not a good way to do it. Instead, you want the arguments and the themes of the book as a whole to kind of reemerge and submerge and reemerge again as you read the book. And that feels much more like you're reading one whole contiguous piece of work. And that tends to be something that dissertation writers really have to get out of the habit of, because the dissertation chapters are really, you know, here's a theme or an argument, and when you finish it, like the box is checked, and we're not going to return to it in the further chapters. Yeah.
Ale?
Yeah, just to echo what others have said, because I also acquire in history, that history itself, yeah, is a very like narrative genre in itself. You're telling a story. And so Duke Press traditionally has known to publish in, you know, critical theory and in cultural anthropology specifically. So we've published a lot of ethnographic work. And kind of like Emily was saying, in the ethnographic work, that's one of the places where I really see that like character plot line come out. You know, if the anthropologist is focusing on a particular person in like a particular place or a particular group of people, like, you know, organizing together, like following one specific, like, you know, organization. Like that's one of the books that I've been working on is on street vendor organizing. And so following like different characters that are part of the story. So that's something that I've seen a lot in ethnographic works. And some of the more theoretical books that I've worked on, there's sort of similar to what other people were saying, like a theoretical framework or image that brings the narrative together. So that can serve as like a central point. And so that's something that I've seen in some of like the more theoretical works. Like, for example, the form kind of, I guess, parallels or mirrors like the, you know, theoretical image that the author is trying to convey. So that's something that I've seen. But yeah, I totally agree that with history. And so, yeah, so like I was saying, Duke Press has published in history, specifically like African-American, like Black history. So when I was promoted 2 years ago, my assigned area of acquisition became Latinx history, because our editorial director, you know, really thinks that history books are, you know, that history is one of the disciplines that has that potential to reach a wider audience than academia, because it's telling the story, you know, an undertold story that hasn't been told before. And so that can be appealing to people, you know, looking to learn more about, you know, the place that they come from, like, you know, looking to learn more about like a particular, like activist organization in a particular moment in time, you know, that's related to a cause that they care about. And so that's something that I think, does make it a little bit easier, ideally for historians, is because you are telling a story. And just something kind of very basic, I guess, that I would say is making your introduction. I think, so one of the things that I've noticed in the books that I like reading and like the most successful books is that from the beginning, you're telling an interesting story. So instead of like kind of focusing on like the macro level analysis from the beginning, you know, like it's starting out with like a little vignette that, you know, is a particular like moment in time, or, you know, it's a particular like, I guess if it's like an ethnography, just like a particular instance that like something really interesting happened. So our editorial advisory board, which we kind of talked a little bit about editorial advisory boards before. So the only piece of the manuscript that they're evaluating is the introduction. And so we place a lot of focus on writing a really good and like strong introduction, because a lot of times, sometimes the readers will only read like the introduction to a book and not necessarily the rest of it with academic books. And so I think telling an engaging story from the beginning is something that feels really important to me and that draws people in, and even when I think about myself, like the types of books that I'm interested in, it usually hooks me or not from the beginning. So that's kind of a basic piece of advice, but I do think it matters.
Thank you, Ale. I think that's really great. I don't know if you want to think of, are there any examples of books that come to mind? I'm a huge fan of Jill Lepore, which I think a lot of people are. But These Truths, she does a really amazing technique where she'll like introduce somebody and then let them go away and then bring them back about like why they're important and why they've really changed things. I mean, that's a really beautiful book. In general, it was meant to be a textbook. Norton like talked to her originally about doing it as a textbook, and the writing is so beautiful. She's a New Yorker writer. She's a Harvard professor, if that means something to you. And it's just a beautiful book, and really mind-changing in the way that it takes people that you wouldn't expect were really important in American history and shows just kind of this hidden side to American history, all based on human rights. And it works on so many levels. And I think Ale and Stephen alluded to those moments where you really hook a reader in with the details so that the book kind of falls away and you get immersed into the feelings of the character and the smells and the situation. That can really make a big difference. Do people have a book that they would recommend just in terms of pure beauty of the writing and the narrative sweeping you away? Feel free to jump in.
I don't know if my colleagues feel the same, but because I read nonfiction all day for my job, I do not relax by reading other people's nonfiction. So I tend to read like novels and poetry in my off time. But I will say, I will confess this. I realize that I don't know a lot at all about European history because I do US history. And it became this kind of like embarrassing blind spot when I was talking to people and they're like, oh, you know, the Plantagenets. I figured, yeah, I've heard of them. So I started reading British History for Dummies. And he has it's by Sean Lang, UK historian, and he does this really effective thing in the introduction, I think, which is to provide this, there's something we usually don't like in introductions, which is like the 30-second house tour, which is the like, in chapter 1, I will, and in chapter 2, I will. But he does this really effective thing where he gives a grand sweep, like a 30,000-foot view of British history, especially kind of washing away the perception that there has always been one British people, but really the British Isles have been invaded and conquered and reconquered in a series of like attacks and reprisals and a really shifting population for 3,000 or 4,000 years. And then he returns to like kind of starting at the beginning of the story. So I was struck by how someone could do something very well that I always warn authors against doing. That's my example.
Excellent. Laura?
Yeah, I actually have, I was working on a book today that I wish I could share, but it's not quite there yet. But with an author who had an introduction that was very well written, but just assumed a lot of like a very high baseline level of knowledge on the reader. And so I said, look, you know, this is your front door, right? You know, if you scare people at this point thinking that they're going to need to know way more sort of 17th century poetry than most people know, they're going to put this book down and they're going to go watch The Last of Us. You know what I mean? And he was able to rewrite that and make the introduction much more inviting and sort of intriguing. And I think, you know, it is not any less sort of learned or erudite, but it is, you know, the kind of thing that would make you go.
Oh, we lost you. Laura? Why don't we, that was a good cliffhanger. Ale, you want to jump in for a minute and then we'll switch off?
Sure. Yeah, so one of the examples that I thought about is...
Oh, Laura, sorry, Ale, Laura's back, so have her finish the thought. Sorry, you
Yeah.
set us up really well, and then
Where did you lose me?
you were about to say the title, and then we got cut off. It was
We
good.
haven't finalized the title yet, but no, it's I think the introduction, Ali sort of alluded to this, you know, the introduction is worth spending a lot of time on, both when you're proposing the book to an editor, but also in the final product, because it's your front door, right? It's your first date. You know, don't alienate people on the first date. So
Excellent. Ale?
Yeah, so one of the examples that I thought about is a book that by Ricky Rodriguez, and it's one of our more like cultural studies, you know, music studies books, which came out in September of last year, so September 2022. It's called A Kiss Across the Ocean, Transatlantic Intimacies of British Post-Punk and US Latinidad. So in it, the author is looking at the relationship between punk music and like, you know, Latinos, and why do so many Latinos like love punk music, especially like, you know, music of like the 80s. And so, yeah, so he's kind of looking at this kind of like unexpected cultural like dynamic and exchange that, you know, people don't usually think about, but it's actually pretty big. So like, for example, if you go to Los Angeles, you know, there's a lot of like punk like parties, you know, that cater to like, you know, Latinx people, like the Smiths, like, you know, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, like all these different sort of like 80s like British post-punk bands. And so in the book itself, he also ties in his personal narrative. And I think this is one of like, you know, this is one of the more recent examples of a successful crossover book, I would say, because I think it's been covered on like Rolling Stone, like NPR. I think maybe it was like review. Yeah, it's just been reviewed in a lot of like bigger outlets than a lot of our other books. And the author has been on like a speaking tour to like, you know, all these like different like bookshops, and yeah, just been on like podcasts. So it's been a successful example of that. And I think something that makes it successful relates to something that Laura was saying in the beginning, which is in some disciplines, it's a little bit easier to like insert yourself into the story. And so that's the case with this book. Like Ricky, the author, is really able to talk about like his own experiences of growing up like a punk Latinx kid. Yeah, and so tying that like personal narrative with the like theorizations and like, you know, the history that he gives is really effective. And yeah, so he opens up the book, you know, with personal narrative, like telling a story from his youth. So yeah, so that's one example that I would say. And I can paste the link to the book in the chat.
Awesome.
And you can read the introduction for free. So that's available.
Excellent.
For people who are interested.
Excellent. Emily, any examples that come to mind for you?
Well, yes, and also I have a broader thought attached to it. So a book that I recently encountered, which I think is just a really wonderful example of narrative historical storytelling, is Taya Miles' All That She Carried, which is a book that follows 3 generations of women, beginning with an enslaved mother who is separated from her daughter in the 1850s, and follows their stories through an object, a sack, that her daughter, she gave to her daughter before they were parted. And so this is an example, I think, of what we were talking about earlier. There is a way to write narrative nonfiction. I think history, again, especially lends itself to this, that is tied to the lives of individuals, and in this case, across multiple generations. That's the backbone of the book. I would also say One thing I always advise authors, especially when you're at the start of your career, is keep a running list of books whose style you admire, whose introductions you admire, and keep a list of who's publishing those books. You certainly want to keep a list of who's publishing books in your field, like what publishers are you seeing again and again in your bibliography and your works cited. But then I think there's a separate list, a parallel list of books that have sort of a style or a way of telling the story that you admire. And it is also interesting to see where those books are being published, by whom, and to use them as models as you're thinking about sort of what directions you might take your own writing after the dissertation.
I think that's really great. I think that's really great. Nancy Mitford, I give a big plug to. I guess scholars don't always really love her, but boy, is she a lot of fun. She does biographies, and that's something that I've found with my own clients too, especially people with backgrounds in English. Like getting people to focus on a biography has a natural arc to it, with danger and fear, and are they going to make it? And that can be a really good way to start on something that's going to be naturally narrative. We've talked a little bit about crossover hits. What is a crossover hit? Well, maybe we'll go back. We'll put it into a little context. So you guys get a proposal. You're kind of interested in it, and then you have to do you have to talk to your colleagues. You have to do a P&L. Like, how does that come together? That you go, I think there's an audience here. I think this author has the authority, the authenticity. How big do you think this book can be? Do you need to figure out what the sales are? How many libraries would take it? How do you go about that decision of seeing is there a market for a book? Laura, you want to start?
Sure, I'll take a stab at that one. So I will, this is one of the biggest decisions that we make, and it's one of the hardest. So university presses will typically publish in a couple of different publishing categories. Different UPs will have different words for what that is, but it's just a category. So one is trade books. Those are, that is a market where we are competing in some cases with smaller trade publishers to acquire a book. Some university presses will have a sort of academic trade category. And that's sort of a general interest book, but maybe not quite as general, right? We all publish monographs, which are specialized works. Some university presses will publish reference books. That's getting rarer and rarer because reference books just are not really a thing anymore. That's now an online business by and large. Some university presses will publish textbooks, which is a book that is intended to be assigned for the entirety of a semester course or a 2-semester course. We will also publish what we call course books, which is a book that is intended for use in a course, but not necessarily for the whole semester, right? So it might be a week or 2 on the syllabus. But the biggest decision we are making is this a trade book? Can we find a general interest audience for this? The test that I usually talk about and think about is does this pass the my dad test, which is, my dad's not an academic. If he were interested in this topic, which he may or may not be, right? But if he were, could he pick this up and read it? Would it make sense to him, right? And if the answer is no, then in my judgment, the book is probably a monograph. That does have implications for how books are sold, how they're marketed, how they're distributed to bookstores, which is probably too boring to get into here in any great detail. But it does mean generally a monograph, you will not see it on a shelf at a brick and mortar bookstore. And there are sort of structural reasons for that. So.
Oh, Emily, want to weigh in?
So I have a sort of a related thought, which is I think it's really important, especially in a book proposal and in the early stages of conversation with an editor, that you, as the author, have a strong and realistic sense of who your audience is, right? So there's going to be a moment in your book proposal where you actually talk about audience. And a couple things here, right? You don't want to say that the book is for like a dozen different fields and disciplines, because if it's for everyone, then it's for no one. So I think the most effective book proposals really focus in on, what are the handful, perhaps, of overlapping fields, we're talking about a scholarly book, that need this book, as I said before, and why. And the why is really important. And it has to be framed for, I think, the book proposal too. I like the my dad test. I think that absolutely pertains to the book proposal. The book proposal is for an editor who does not necessarily have a PhD in your field, and for my colleagues in other departments as well. And there's no assumption that anyone has a working understanding of X or Y. So you got to frame that in ways that someone outside your department will sort of grasp immediately. We'll come back to the book proposal. But the other thing I would say is don't feel pressure to describe a book as a general interest book or a crossover book. I'm not even sure I know what a crossover book is in sort of vague general terms. If it's not, right? I publish very fine scholarly monographs that are meant for a narrow subfield of readers. And I also publish books that are aiming for a larger audience, some, you might say, a trade audience, sort of readers, a subset of readers outside the academy. If you, the author, are sending mixed signals about what you think the book is doing, that's a flag that maybe there's some misalignment, right, around goals. So sometimes I read beautiful proposals for what are really scholarly monographs. And there's always a line thrown in there, like this could also be for, quote, general readers. And you really don't need that if it's not true. And often when I talk with an author, that's the first thing I probe when we talk about audience. Like, what do you mean when you say it's also for a, quote, general reader? Who is that reader? So that's a little bit moving in the direction of the crossover book question. So I'll stop there.
That's excellent. Ale?
Yeah, just to kind of go off a little bit of what about related to what Emily was saying. I think it really depends on the author, like what kind of book they want to write. And at Duke Press, I would say that we're open to both. Like we're open to the more like traditional scholarly monograph. And if an author has ambitions for writing like a trade, more, I guess, commercial book that will appeal to a broader audience, we're also open to that. And usually, for example, when we're working with historians, we want that conversation to be had as early as possible. And I will say, I see it more with people who are working on like their second or third book. So they've already written like the 10-year book, like the first book. And so this happened to me recently with a historian. She's really interested, like, she already wrote like her first book, got tenure. And so now she's interested in writing just a book that about like, the role of women and like during the Mexican Revolution, but in a way that will be like really accessible to just a broader readership. And so I think it really does depend. One example that I can think about, in also last year, we published this book called Subversive Habits, Black Catholic Nuns in the Long African American Freedom Struggle. And that's written by a historian, Shannon D. Williams. And even though she didn't write the book necessarily in a trade way, I think it's been adopted like very, like more broadly outside of field experts, because again, it's telling that like undertold or never told like story that people are interested in. So like what's the history of Black Catholic nuns in the United States? Like this is the first, and I think probably like one of the only books that really touches specifically on like Catholic nuns. And so I know like, you know, some like more progressive, like anti-racist religious organizations have like taken up this book in some of their like reading circles. And so, yeah, so kind of like, I think sometimes like, yeah, I just think about like, what are the ways that the book can be adopted to influence like practitioners or like organizers or activists, you know, in a particular movement. So yeah, so I think that like this book, for example, Subversive Habits, like really appeals to like a broader audience of, you know, people who are like Catholic practitioners interested in, I guess, making the church more progressive or like anti-racist. And so, yeah, so that's something, that's what I'll contribute.
So it found a very specific audience that was able to make it grow.
Yeah, that was like, yeah, and like this growth was needed in this like other institution, like the Catholic Church. So it just kind of found that place.
That's great. We talked a little bit about proposals. Is there a good, do people want to like weigh in? Is there a good template for a proposal? What should a proposal have? What is a proposal? Kind of, it's just at 7 o'clock. We can do this maybe as a lightning round if people just want to weigh in.
I want to point out a thing that will become obvious as soon as I say it, but that I think a lot of people don't realize, which is that on some level, the book proposal doesn't matter because it's never going to be published. You can send me the most beautiful book proposal and I will gush over it and I will call you and we'll talk about it and it will be great. But that document is never going to be published, right? So this is an 85% game, right? Do not sit on your book proposal until you feel that it is 100% polished to a high gloss, white glove shine. You do not need to do that. Do not, you know, you need to give us the information that we need and you need to be excited about it and you need to be clear about what the book is and what the big idea is in the book. But like, you know, don't psych yourself out on this one, guys. It's just send the proposal, please. We want to see it.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. The proposal is so secondary to even our consideration of what is a good book or not to pursue. I mean, often I ask authors who I'm in touch with pre-proposal to just send me like a half-baked draft that we can work on. Really what I'm evaluating the book on is first whether it's a field in which we publish. You know, I say I'm a U.S. history editor. History is this megalithic field. You look at AHA and the 100 subsections they have, each of which is a subfield of history, and I do 4 or 5 of those. So if it is something like diplomatic history, U.S. and the world, urban history, I do those. And then I look at certain, you know, career markers usually. You know, is this person, did they come out of a good program? Have they been publishing? Are they, the books that we publish that are monographs are part of a conversation. You know, it's scholars talking to each other. And I just want to see that it's a field in which I publish and it's an author who is in the conversation. You know, is going to conferences, is on panels, is reading his or her peers' work, and thus his or her work will be read by their peers. And yeah, the proposal is really, I'm happy to, you know, almost sign a book up off of a phone call.
I would echo what both of you have said. The proposal is a starting point. It should start to project a vision for the book, right? So if you wrote a dissertation and you know that you want to add a chapter or 2 or do something different in the book, right? You describe what your best idea of the contours of the book is in the moment that you are writing the proposal. But books change, again, just as with the dissertation, books change radically from what you pitched in the proposal, sometimes even often. And sometimes I get a proposal that I can tell there's something there, but I have questions or it's not framed in quite the right way. And at that point, I might ask the author to hop on the phone and talk me through it. And I'll ask a bunch of questions. Sometimes people say beautiful things about the book while talking that aren't in the proposal. So then I might say, okay, can you put that in writing? Can you give me another version of the proposal? And that is a really lovely exercise in miniature of editorial collaboration. It gives you a sense on both sides of how you might work together on the book itself. Different editors at different presses are going to approach sort of the proposal process differently. But I think it's a really good moment to workshop even a document that if I am excited about, I'm eventually going to bring to my colleagues. And so often something I see is it's pitched wrong, right? It's pitched to scholars in your field. You're going to need to give me and my colleagues sort of some more basic building blocks to get us where you're going in the book proposal. And it can pay to do some work on that together before I present it to my colleagues in the house. But I 100% echo the feedback that you do not have to tie the book proposal up in a perfect bow to send it. It should be complete, but it's a working document and you will very quickly leave it behind.
Excellent. Ale, anything to add there?
Not too much to add. I think, yeah, everything was covered.
Excellent. Is there, so I have some resources. I'll have my email is ko142@columbia.edu if you want some resources about what's in the proposal. And I also have some resources about where you can find what presses do what kinds of books. The AUP has a grid that just goes on and on and on with all the different publishers for academic presses and what they cover, and then you can use that to check out their websites and figure out like, hey, that might be a good one for my book. Can we talk a little bit about the editorial review process? That's very, very different at an academic publisher than from a trade house. Who are you trying to satisfy? What kinds of questions are you getting? How does that all happen to come together? Ale, you want to start us off?
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, so this is something that makes the university press, I believe, different than other types of publishers. So we go through a peer review process. So the book gets sent out at Duke Press to 2 experts within the field. So when we're about to send the product, or when the author submits a manuscript to us, we ask them for a list of recommended reviewers, as well as we ask them also for a do not contact list if, for any reason there are like specific scholars that they do not want us to contact for review. And obviously we'll respect that. And so the acquisition editor, so myself, I then go through that list, as well as just, my like knowledge of like the field or like different reviewers that we have queried in the past at Duke Press. I go in and select two reviewers for the project. And so at Duke Press, we do, and I think this is the case with like most university presses, a single blind peer review process. So the reviewers know who the author is, but the author does not know who the peer reviewers are. And again, just to reiterate, the peer reviewers are experts in the field, so they'll be the best position to give feedback, like give a recommendation to put the book under contract or not. And just really be able to speak on what the impact of the book will be on the field and what's like the contribution that the book is making, the intervention that the book is making. And so at Duke Press, we go through a pretty intensive peer review process. So we usually, like on average, we send the books out for review twice. We send a book out for review 2 rounds. Sometimes it might be 3. In like very rare cases, we'll send it out to 4 rounds of review. But essentially what we're looking for is what we call the sign-off report. So a final report from the reviewers, saying that there's very minimal revision left to do, or simply stating that there's no more revision left to do and the book is, at a publishable state at that point because it's grown through the review process. And so that's at Duke Press, that the review is very much related to the contract stage. And I think, the contract stage is something that varies at different presses. And so we offer contract after the first round of review. And usually our standard is like for first-time authors, we like to send the full manuscript out for review. And then when it's somebody, who's already published before, who already has a first book, then we send a partial manuscript out for review. So that might be like the proposal, if they have one, plus like 2 chapters and the introduction. So at Duke Press, we make the assessment whether we'll offer contract or not after we see that first round of review. So that's, I think, what I'll say.
I'm gonna just jump in here that I've had clients who've been really looking forward to that, to having the peer review process, to having people who are experts who weren't at their university working on their dissertation give them feedback. Does anyone want to jump in there? I'm just checking the time where it's almost 7:10. And if you have a question in the audience, if you have a question, feel free to type it in. I put my email address in there. So you feel free to email me with any follow-up as well. But we'd love to get your questions and we have time for that. Anyone want to talk about the editorial review process, the peer review process?
I think Alec covered it really well. I'll just reinforce the point that it is the one standard across university presses is that the final manuscript is going to be peer reviewed positively before it could go into production and become a book. But whether it's reviewed before contract as a proposal, how much material the press wants, that's all going to be different press to press, even editor to editor. Some presses have the ability to offer contract without the project going through review or the board or anything like that, and others have to. And some presses only want to see full manuscripts and not proposals. So one thing to do is it's good to query your potential editor and just find out what their standards are, what they want to see before they would be before they could offer you a contract, and even just if they're interested. Most of the books I turn down I don't turn them down because of a quality issue, but it's just because it's not a subfield or field in which I publish. And going to conferences and walking the exhibit halls is a good way to see who is actively publishing in your field.
I just want to make 2 quick points about peer review. The first is that a peer review, ideally, one of the things that it does is it gives you a preview of how people are going to react to the book when it's published. And that is a really useful thing to have. There may be things that you decide, some people are going to have a problem with this aspect of my book, and that's too bad. And that is fine. And then the other thing I would say is that a peer review is not a to-do list. It is not a set of marching orders. You are free to disagree with peer reviewers. I do, part of our process is we ask authors to write a formal response to the peer reviews. And in that response, I always tell my authors, you are free to disagree with what this person recommends, but you need to tell us why, and you need to explain your thinking. And you need to explain your thinking at a non-expert level, because again, none of us are specialists in the thing that you are the world's expert in. We may disagree with you. We may say, actually, we think you really should do that. But it's very common for someone to say like, hey, this is a great idea for my next book. I can't do it in this book. And it's fine to just say that.
Anything to add there, Emily? Sorry about that.
No, I would echo everything that has been said. And the editor and the peer reviewers, I'll just add, they play different roles, right? So I mentioned that we at HUP, we offer our contracts up front and then peer review down the line. And what that allows me to do is to do some work on the book with the author. I'm thinking about it as a book. Are the arguments clear? Does the structure make sense? Is the narrative, as we've been talking about there? I'm not going to be able to catch the kind of things that the peer reviewers can catch. And as Laura sort of alluded to, Those things ideally we catch before the book is out in the world and someone catches it in a scholarly review and prints it for all the world to see, right? So I am often just really amazed and grateful at the attention and care that readers give these manuscripts. Sometimes the readers disagree with one another. The reports are conflicting, and that's a moment, right, where you sit down with your editor and you say, what makes sense for this book? As Laura said, as long as you explain yourself clearly, it's okay to take issue with one or the other. And we also do 2 single blind readers of the readers' perspectives. But the readers play a really important role as your peers, as fellow scholars, and they will have feedback for you that your editor just cannot, because your editor is not an expert in the field.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. So the book has been sold, you've gotten a contract, you've agreed to terms, you've delivered the contract, you've delivered the book. Now comes the time for it to come out into the world. What's it about? Emily, you want to take that? Am I off?
Sure. So this is a moment where we sort of revisit those early conversations about audience, right? Because we're thinking about publicity and marketing, getting the book out into the world. So the writing comes first, right? The way that we shape, we edit, we develop the book. You could do all of the marketing in the world to a particular audience, but if the writing doesn't invite that audience to the table, it's a no-go, right? So this begins with the editorial work, talking about who the book is for. Is it written, pitched to those readers? But then comes the package. Like, what's the right jacket design? Who should blurb the book? How do you describe it in 250 words on the flap and on the website and in the catalog, such that it invites the readers we want to encourage to pick up the book and read more? We think about, what are the list of scholarly journals that we need and want to send this book to for review? What are the conferences this book should go to? If we are aiming for some non-scholarly coverage of the book, what more mainstream publications do we send it to? Is this a book for readers of The Economist? Is this a book for readers of N+1? There's all sorts of questions that I sit down with the author and start to brainstorm and then take to my colleagues in marketing and publicity and sales, and they are the experts in all of these areas. My job is to translate what the book is doing and for whom. And then my colleagues go out and make sure those readers can see the book in the world through whatever venues are the right ones. That's a basic start to an answer. I'm curious what others have to say.
Laura, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say one very simple thing that you can do at that stage is every publisher will have some version of a marketing questionnaire or marketing form. Please fill that out. Like, please don't blow it off. I know it is annoying. Nobody likes doing it. It's like a combination of doing like your taxes and your annual performance review. It's unpleasant. I understand. It is a really important tool for us because we have sort of separate moving pieces in our marketing operation, right? So we have a promotions team, we have a publicity team, we have a sales team. They're all doing slightly different things, but they need similar kinds of information. So please fill out the author questionnaire. We are a little bit adrift without it.
Excellent. Ale?
Yeah, I'll just add, part of that marketing questionnaire is like potential awards that your book can be submitted to. Also, if we want to have it in like the conference ads, like the conference programs, if there's any like promotional materials that need to be, made from the book. And that's usually a decision, that's, made by the marketing department. But the marketing questionnaire is really that space to fully express like your vision for the book. And then beyond that, I would just encourage authors to like share their book, like be proud of it, like go to social media, academic Twitter is a big venue for people to talk about what's exciting. And as an editor, I don't solely go off based of like social media, but I feel like academic Twitter is kind of, just an interesting space to follow to see, what people are sharing and what people are talking about. And just to echo that, I really think that the job of the acquisitions editor is to be the best like internal advocate for the book. So at every stage of the process, we're always just, like advocating for the book to reach its like full potential and advocating for the author. So I really think that my job as an acquisitions editor is that internally.
Excellent. Stephen, anything to add?
Sure. Yeah, I completely agree with everything everyone said. And I would just say that there is a real role for you, the author, after publication. You probably, everyone in this Zoom room is probably an arts and science PhD student. Most likely the first book that you write is going to be a dissertation, a book that doesn't necessarily pass the DAD test. And the press is going to be good at getting your book in front of your peers. We'll get it, the journal reviews, get it at the exhibit halls, get it in course adoptions, submit it for awards, and winning an award is kind of like the mountaintop for your first book. But, and that your peers are the ones who are going to read it like cover to cover. They're going to read the book. But it's very likely that your book has a nugget of an argument that can be consumed in a much more digestible format and that people outside the academy care about. I did a book, it's coming out in a few months, and it's about, US, Taiwan, and China during the Cold War. It was a dissertation, it's a monograph, it's a scholarly book, but the arguments of the book very much bear on contemporary tensions in Taiwan Strait. And so this author is out writing op-eds and he's doing podcast interviews. And a lot of this is these are kind of substitutionary goods. The people who hear this podcast or read this op-ed probably won't buy and read the book, but at least they've heard your argument and you've gotten your argument out in the world. So I would just say that as the author, the press will take care of a lot of like book publicity, but I think the author, it's on him or her to do the like argument publicity.
That's excellent. We have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to ask the third rail question. Will you get rich from an academic contract, from an academic book? When people just want to weigh in, I think I know the answer to that.
I would advise another line of work if that's your goal.
Anyone else? I think that's consensus by silence. There's been a question that's come up a couple times of like, what is it like to work at a university press? How does it happen? What kind of background do you need? How do you get into it? And what is your day like? What do you do? Yeah, and it's just a free question. Let's just open it up.
I can start. It's very varied. I know a lot of the editors at DUP have PhDs. I don't have a PhD, but I think part of what helped me get this job was I had been my professor's assistant on her book project in undergrad. And so I had done for one book project a lot of the things that I ended up doing at Duke Press for like multiple book projects at a time. And so, I think that's something that really helped me. I know, at Duke Press, we have an internship program. So both like undergraduate students and graduate students can apply to our internship program. So that's another way that people can get into the industry. Just to say, like a lot of people who have PhDs, it's like academic publishing is a very like academia adjacent sort of profession. So we have a lot of people who left or like who finished their PhD programs and transitioned into academic publishing, or people who left academic publishing to go back to get their PhD. And I think that's the case for Emily. So I guess I'll pass it on.
Great. You are the queen of the segues. I gotta go. Emily, go for it.
That was a great segue. And I'll just say too, if anyone wants to talk more about this offline, you can send me an email. My email's on the HUP website. I know Kevin also has all of our emails. But in brief, I was a graduate student who became pretty sure partway through my career in graduate school that I did not want to pursue an academic job. What I loved was working on writing. I loved teaching. I loved working with students. I loved thinking about how to structure a piece of writing, whether it was a 5-page essay, an undergraduate essay, or a chapter of a friend's dissertation. And I started exploring careers in publishing through actually an internship program. MIT Press has a fabulous internship program that I did when I was a graduate student one summer. And then I started picking up some freelance copy editing, developmental editing, just getting into the world of publishing as much as I could. And now I've transitioned into a role where I get to do the thing I love all the time, which is to think about books in the ways we've been talking about today. I also think about books in very different ways than I did as a graduate student, right? I'm thinking about financial projections. I'm thinking about jacket design. I'm thinking about marketing and publicity. I've learned a lot from my colleagues in other departments about making books the object that is a book, in addition to thinking about sort of how to get from point A to point B within a manuscript.
Excellent. Laura?
Yeah, I was a student intern at my current employer when I was a student. So that was it's a little weird. So I came in the opposite way that from what Emily did. I do not have a PhD. I got a student job in the manuscript editorial department at Hopkins about 20 years ago. And my main task in that job was copy editing indexes, actually, which at that time I did on paper with a red pencil. And what I learned from that is that many people many extremely smart, learned, erudite people with terminal degrees cannot alphabetize things. And I think that was a really useful perspective for me to have going into this business, right? Because I think, there is a tendency to think, the author is the expert and, they can do no wrong, and they are the expert and they know what they're talking about. But also, and this is not a criticism, I understand, but many of you cannot alphabetize things, and that is okay. That's why we're here. Fair enough.
That's your value. It was one of our value adds in the
That is my value add. It's knowing the alphabet.
Stephen?
Yeah, I agree with all this too. I too was once an intern who clawed his way out of that into a job. And publishing has a little bit of like a supply side problem. A lot of people want to write books. A lot of people want to work in publishing. And when we have like an editorial assistant position open up, we get hundreds of applicants. And I can only speak for the job searches we've done here that I've been a part of. But the first thing that we do is we separate those applications of people who have a demonstrated interest in publishing or in the book profession widely. There's a lot of applicants we get that are like English major undergraduate, and publishing is kind of like an afterthought job after they get out of college. But we really look for people who have interned is a good one. If you're a graduate student and there's a student work option with the university press at your home institution, that's a good option. I know editors who were once industry book buyers. They worked at bookstores, interfacing with the sales reps and learning about the industry that way. My very first job in publishing was at a literary agency as an intern. And so there's a lot of jobs. There are fellowships. There's a Mellon Diversity Fellowship with University Presses through the AUP. So there's a lot of ways to kind of show that you're interested in working with books and that this isn't like a plan B for you. For some people it does work out as a plan B, but I just know when we've hired assistants, the first thing we look for is who really wants to work in publishing, especially because the early years as an assistant are pretty grindy, and we look for people who are committed to climbing the ladder, I guess you could say.
Excellent.
I would add one thing to what Stephen said, which is working in a bookstore also counts. And that's actually a really great experience, because even if you want to go into editorial, having experience in a different publishing function that is, in this case, sales, is really useful, and having that perspective is really useful.
Excellent. Thanks, Laura. Sam had a question in the chat. Do you need to get a PhD? Do you need to have a PhD to get published by a university press? Anyone want to add? I see a lot of shaking heads. No. Anyone want to add a color to that?
I would actually say in most cases, yes. The way that I phrase it is we are looking for, well, we do a lot of medical publishing. So many of our authors have MDs, which is also fine. We are looking for people who have a terminal degree or equivalent practitioner experience in most cases.
A lot of nods yes here. We have just a couple minutes left. One of the things I asked everyone to do is to think about a book that they're really excited about, to shamelessly plug. And on that note, we have our last Zoom panel for the semester is next week, March 30th, where we're going to talk specifically about trade publishing, what agents and publishers and editors do, with Naomi Eisenbeis from Inkwell, Prannoy Sakar from Little Brown, and Michaela Tabron from Amistad. Thank you very much. Gabby put it right there in the chat. And thanks again to Gabby, Unisha, Selena, and Ishel for making this all happen. So go ahead, lightning round. Ale, you got it. You got a book?
Yes, I do have one. So one of our books that was just published this month that just came out is called The Latinx Guide to Graduate School. So it's a handbook co-authored by two Latinx studies scholars, which essentially, breaks down advice for Latinx identifying people to navigate graduate school. So if that applies to anybody here, or if you have any friends who are Latinx, who are thinking about going to grad school or who are in grad school currently. Just something that I love about this project is how it demystifies grad school, connects people to resources, and how two experts in the field are really embodying mentorship that, to produce this resource that will help a lot of people. And I think a lot of the stuff can be applicable to first-gen scholars, other scholars of color who are navigating the academy. So yeah, that's the one that I'll plug.
Excellent, thanks. Stephen.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, since you're Columbia people, and I assume you live in New York, I chose one that is New York centric. I don't know if you can see it, but this is buried. It's reversed on my screen. It's Buried Beneath the City. It is an archaeological history of New York City. It's a beautiful 4-color book full of images and figures and maps. And it is at once an introduction to urban archaeology as a field. So how do you conduct a dig underneath a skyscraper, which is very interesting. And it's a book of little history. Big history is who won the war, who got elected president, that sort of stuff. But this is not documentary history; it's archaeological history. So it shows you the quotidian. How did normal people live? What kind of medicine did they take? What clothes did they wear? How did they prepare their food? And I really like that it treats the local New York area and all the people from the pre-Columbian, indigenous, Lenape, to the Dutch, to the British, to the Americans, puts them all kind of under one roof. And it's a lot of fun to work on. And I think since you're New Yorkers, you might enjoy it.
Excellent. Emily.
Yes. So I just published this book out in January. Travis Sadeh's Wonders and Rarities, the marvelous book that traveled the world and mapped the cosmos. And it's a story about a book of wonders composed by a 13th century Persian scholar by the name of Zakaria Kazwini, which arguably became the most influential work of its kind. It traveled all over the world across centuries. in Arabic and Persian and Turkish and Urdu. And it offered a compendium of knowledge about natural history, astronomy, geography, medicine, the animal world, including hosts of magical creatures and phenomena. And eventually from the 19th century, it came to be seen through a very Orientalist and imperialist perspective as an emblem of Muslim superstition. And it's never really recovered from that positioning until this book. And what the author argues is that Qazwini's text actually offers this incredible rational scientific approach to magic, and that through the book we can chart a long history of the place of wonder in Islamic thought. This is also a book that I think is an incredibly rigorous academic book at its core, but the author has a lot of fun with storytelling and actually mimicking some of Qazwini's style. Qazwini loved long lists of magical creatures and objects and sort of rich description, beautifully illustrated manuscript pages, and we've tried to echo some of that magic in Travis's book.
Excellent. Laura?
So you put one in the chat, but you know, a project that Kevin and I worked together on, but I don't actually have anything to hold up for that book yet.
I do. So this is the one that Laura and I are working on. Shamelessly plugging, because it's not only Laura and I working on it, but it takes place on 116th Street at the Harlem World Club, July 3rd, 1981, when the fantastic oh man, now I'm getting it wrong.
The Cold Crush Brothers and the Fantastic
Romantic Five went head to head in the hip hop music showdown. So.
And at some point it will be an actual book and not just a thing on Kevin's phone. But I brought this book on Nixon's Madness, which is an emotional history of Richard Nixon. For various reasons, Nixon has been at the forefront of my mind for the past 7 or 8 years. And I brought this one because you can see it's sort of going out of focus here. We use this terrifying Nixon mask on the jacket. And one of the interesting things I learned in working on this book was that presidential masks in general tend to, like the sales tend to rise and fall when the person is in office, right? So like Clinton masks when Clinton is in office, but Nixon masks never stop selling. They sell all the time, sort of steadily, and have since the 70s. And I thought, that is such an interesting thing to know about America. So, and also this has given everyone in the office nightmares. So
yeah, that's
sorry.
So much fun. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much for saying yes and for doing this. Much appreciated. And I'm so glad to be in touch with all of you. We have our last meeting next week. Please sign up. Feel free to reach out to me. It's my uni is KO 142, and you know the rest, Columbia EDU, and it's in the chat. And I will have lists of the books, and I'll have some materials as well. And be free to get you in touch with folks if you have any questions. Thank you so much.